All right, so for another part of the how-to series, we're going to talk about fuel pumps, um, the staging effect of fuel pumps, the staging of injectors for a larger fuel system for a car, um, fuel coolers when they're needed, when they're not. Um, that's enough. So we'll cover that. So, temperature of your fuel. If you live in a hot climate, you might notice that your fuel evaporates. And this is also having to do with the pressure of the fuel system. There are check valves in a factory gas tank that are designed to release pressure into a charcoal canister so you don't smell the vapor when it's released. And it's an emissions thing, but as well as the tank needs to vent as the fuel expands, and the gasoline will change forms from a liquid to a gaseous at a certain temperature. And it's really simple. Let me kind of show you guys the most basic principles of when you have a higher pressure, your chance of evaporation goes down. Okay, so if we're talking about a pressurized fuel cell, you can take a cavitating fuel system that is internally boiling. Mind you guys, if you ever remember, it was like middle school, you can put, I think it was like water in a vacuum cell, and you pull all the vacuum on that is possible from a vacuum pump, and you can boil the water at room temperature. Okay, now apply this same fluid mechanic to your fuel system. You're going to see exactly why this is very important. So, what happens when we have cold fuel? That means it's more accurate, and the mass quantity, the density of that fuel is actually higher. We produce more power from that fuel at the same whatever volume that it may be. So, I know I'm skipping around a little bit. This is quite a big subject to, I guess, distill into a small video without making it 20 minutes. But so far you're understanding that we need a pressurized fuel cell to get rid of cavitation in a fuel tank. In factory form, they're currently working to maintain a small level of pressure in that tank, and then there's usually an electronic valve that opens up that transfers the excess pressure into a charcoal canister to release it. But the reality is, a fuel temperature needs to maintain at a certain level. And what happens when you add multiple fuel pumps? And what kind of fuel pumps are you adding? Well, older fuel pump designs are very inefficient, in which they're pumping and they're heating the fuel as it's being pumped. If it's a far too large of a fuel pump system, that fuel goes up to your engine, which is hot. Then it comes back down to the fuel tank, heats up again as it's now cycling, goes through the fuel pump again, and your overabundance of cycling the fuel over and over again creates a point where the fuel starts to evaporate. What's the solution? Well, with modern pumps, I believe Walbro 340 and the 450 were the earlier ones that had the twin screw, which are significantly quieter. You're thinking about like a supercharger screw style inside the pump. The efficiency jump from going to that design was massive. So in the same footprint area, you're getting a significant pressure and flow increase without nearly as much temperature. And then take this a step further, instead of it always being 100% on, 100% off, now you have pulse width modulated, solid state relayed fuel pumps, which means you only have the amount of pump capacity to maintain, let's say, a 5% return fuel flow at a given time. So you can simply calculate, based on fuel mass being used, that your pump just stays a little bit ahead of the curve. You can do that based on throttle position, you can do that based on map pressure, you can do it based on actual grams per second of fuel flow used, and then back calculate it to the pulse width modulation of your fuel pump controls. Still sick. Almost better though. So anyways, the step further is now we're controlling our fuel pumps and our regulators even to produce the amount of fuel that we're going to be using without as much excess. So we can have a big fuel pump that's only running at 10% when you're idling and 20% when you're cruising, and part throttle is at 40%, and then wide open throttle might be 80 to 100%, but it's not going to be 100% all the time. And so we're not dumping excess heat into the system. Okay, see the point? Now the whole fuel system that's used to be cycling over and over again doesn't do that. The return flow is just enough to where you have a little bit of pump and pressure overhead, and if you're using a flex fuel sensor, enough to read the ethanol content coming back. And that's another thing, is those have now been done. Motion Raceworks does one of these. The flex fuel is now being done on the feed side, because now they're running a bypass system on the feed side to where it's always going to be an accurate reading. All right, so we've covered fuel pump stuff. Now, old school ways of doing this would be one huge pump. Okay, that doesn't work. Now we need to go add another pump. Okay, they're both on at the same time. Oh, that's not working. We need a third pump. 3 pumps on at the same time. You're now drawing 80 amps worth of pump. Massive heat going to the motor. Massive heat going into the fuel system. And that methodology evaporates fuel. You lose power every time. And so staging of fuel pumps is a very critical, very important part of tuning in an old school method. And if you don't have the latest and greatest fuel pump stuff, that's fine. You know, nothing against that. It's just a matter of there's a good, a better, and a great way of doing things. You don't always have to go with the most expensive option. So you understand now the pressure, the heat going in the system, and how the system's operating in a whole. So let's see, I'll try to show you guys. This is a pretty cool curve here. Very basic. Temperature at atmosphere, not evaporating very much, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time it reaches 160 degrees Fahrenheit, it's evaporated 10% of your fuel. By the time it's reached 200, maybe 205, 210 degrees Fahrenheit, the fuel temperature, you've evaporated 50% of your initial fuel, and 100% by 225. Now this is based on whatever the Sunoco SR18 is. This will look similar to ethanol and pump gas fuels. These are kind of irrelevant, but you get the idea of the Kelvin evaporative points of different fuels. I do not have time to explain this properly in a chemistry type discussion, but understand that this is universal. Actually, this picture probably would have been helpful, but this is a universal occurrence. And so the way that you should be approaching it is, what is my climate like? What kind of fuel do I use? What kind of pumps am I needing for my system? And how can I get away with putting the least amount of fuel into the engine for getting, let's say, least amount of fuel to the engine without starving the return line flow? And so there are ways of doing this, there's a way of calculating this. I don't have the time to sit down and educate you guys on how to tune an engine. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here to educate as far as the fundamentals of EFI, the understanding of maybe a complex subject broken down into layman's terms, and I can do that for all of you all day long. So, I don't want to get too much into staging, but I will explain that later. And I meant injector staging. The understanding of boiling of fuel can be resolved in a few different problems, or a few different ways. One is, of course, now we're returning our fuel less. We can be using a pulse width modulation pump. We can be using a staged set of fuel pumps instead of all of them on at the same time. We can increase the pressure in the tank, which stops boiling. Okay. We can run a higher fuel pressure, which does drop the total flow of the fuel system. But the higher fuel pressure will be less likely to evaporate. So all of these things are to have less heat in the fuel. Okay? So what's the next step? You have a radiator for your engine coolant. You have an oil cooler. You might have a trans cooler, power steering cooler. Why don't you have a fuel cooler? So this, the size of a fuel cooler, if you imagine the amount of fluid being pumped for an average engine, you can say this engine uses, let's say, 6,000 cc's per minute at wide open throttle. But you're not at wide open throttle for minutes at a time. And when you're cruising, you might be using 600 cc's, 400 cc's, whatever. So if you calculate your average of that, and then you find a cooler that is based on your average of that in a capacity form, and let's say you want it to be a cooling capacity based on the given size. So that cooler, you want to be able to replace the fluid in that cooler, whatever that rectangular size is. If you're going through 500 cc's per minute of fuel flow. Geez, I don't want to make this too complicated. In other words, you could divide it to say the fuel cooler is replacing fluid once a minute. And then you can figure out your size of your cooler needed for that thing. So I'm not going to make it too complicated. Sorry about that. Like I said, still sick. The idea is, by the time that fuel goes through that cooler, whether it's on your feed or return, I would definitely say return side, you're going to have the idea of what you need to keep the system in check. So why do I say return side of the fuel system? I don't like to have my flex fuel sensor on the feed side. I don't like to have anything on the feed side except for my injectors and filters. On the return side, I want to have whatever's left going through my cooler being cooled, because it's now gone into the engine bay, warming up, and it can come back out of the engine bay cooled to drop back into the tank, which is pressurized. There is an optimal pressure. It will be different for each car, but it's somewhere in the realm of about a 5 to 10 psi, which is inherently what they would rate a lift pump that's in a swirl pot for a in-tank surge tank design that is then feeding external inline pumps. So 5 to 10 psi in-tank pressure, adequate sized lines, fuel system goes up to the engine, we feed an adequate amount to the engine, the return flow goes back through the cooler of calculated adequate size, goes back, circles around. Ideally, you want to use pulse width modulated fuel pumps to keep the temperature down, and ideally, if you don't have enough fuel, use 2 or 3. And by using 2 or 3 pumps, you're getting way less heat put in the system. Less heat, more power, more efficiency. You see where I'm going. So I will save the fuel staging for another video, but imagine you're placing the cooling event of your fuel, of your stroke on a non-cooled engine. Your fuel is your coolant. And that's why fuel staging for rotaries is so important. I'll get into that later. So check in for the next one, and see you guys. Peace.